Thomas was the kind of man most people passed by without a second glance. At 52, with silver creeping through his hair and quiet lines etched into the corners of his eyes, he moved through the hallways of the elementary school like a ghost. Always there, always working, but rarely noticed. He wore the same navy blue janitor's uniform every day, the fabric soft from years of wash and wear, the name Thomas stitched neatly over his heart. He'd been working at that public school in Texas for over a decade, long enough to know which ceiling tile still leaked when it rained and which kids needed an extra smile in the morning. But Thomas wasn't the type to talk much. He greeted teachers with a nod, helped the cafeteria staff carry in heavy boxes, and stayed late without being asked, scrubbing floors until they gleamed under the dim fluorescent lights. He didn't do it for recognition. He did it because it was his job, and because someone had to care about the little things. What most didn't know was that Thomas went home to an empty house each night. His wife, Grace, had passed away 5 years earlier after a long illness. The grief never really left him, it just settled in quietly, like dust on a shelf. His daughter, Emily, was away at college now, the first in their family to attend. She worked part-time at the campus bookstore to help cover tuition, and Thomas sent her what he could from his modest paycheck, always telling her to eat well and get some rest. He didn't have much, but what he had, he gave. Not just to his daughter, but to anyone who needed a little extra kindness. A sandwich for a hungry kid. A Band-Aid and a smile after a fall. A gentle word to a child crying in the hallway. No one told him to do those things. He just remembered what it felt like to grow up needing someone and not always finding them. Despite the years, despite the loneliness, Thomas remained steady. He found comfort in his routines, in the quiet hush of an empty school after the final bell rang. It was in those quiet moments, mop in hand, soft music playing from a worn-out radio, that Thomas found a kind of peace. He wasn't chasing anything anymore. Not praise, not wealth, not attention. Just a clean floor, a warm heart, and the hope that maybe somehow he was making the world a little better, one hallway at a time. It was late in the afternoon, long after the last school bell had rung and the classrooms had fallen silent. Most of the students had already gone home, their laughter and footsteps now just echoes in the hallway. Thomas was in his usual rhythm, mop in hand, moving steadily down the corridor, the scent of pine cleaner lingering in the air. The sun outside cast long golden streaks through the windows, painting soft shadows on the floor. That's when he saw him, a small boy sitting alone on the bench outside room 12. His shoulders were hunched, head bowed, tiny hands wiping at his eyes. Thomas slowed his pace, quietly setting the mop aside. He recognized the boy, Lucas, second grade, usually cheerful, the kind of kid who said thank you even when no one expected it. But today, his little face was crumpled in quiet heartbreak. Thomas walked over, his boots soft against the polished floor. He crouched down slowly, careful not to startle him. "You all right there, buddy?" he asked gently. Lucas didn't look up. He just shook his head, trying to hold back more tears. Thomas waited a moment, then sat down beside him, not too close, just enough to show he was there. "I got teased today," Lucas finally whispered. "Because of my clothes. They said I wear the same shirt too much, that my shoes are old." Thomas nodded slowly. He didn't rush to respond, didn't try to fix it right away. He let the silence settle between them, warm and understanding. "My mom says we don't have money for new stuff right now," Lucas added, his voice cracking. "I told her I didn't want to come back to school. I don't want to be here anymore." Thomas turned to face him fully. "You know," he said, his voice low and calm, "when I was your age, I wore the same hand-me-down jeans all year long. Had a hole in one knee and a patch on the other. Kids laughed at me too." Lucas looked at him, wide-eyed. "Really?" Thomas nodded. "They sure did. But I'll tell you something someone once told me a long time ago, and I never forgot it." He paused, then said, "You don't need new clothes to be a good person. You just need a clean heart." Lucas blinked, his breathing evening out. Thomas reached for his lunchbox, the old metal kind, scratched and faded with years of use. He opened it and pulled out a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, then a small carton of juice. "I was gonna save this for later," he said with a wink. "But I think maybe you need it more than I do right now." Lucas hesitated, then took the sandwich with both hands, like it was something sacred. "Thank you, Mr. Thomas." "You're welcome, son." They sat like that for a while, just a janitor and a little boy, sharing a meal and a quiet moment in an empty hallway. No one else around. No cameras. No applause. Just kindness in its purest form. When the school bus pulled up outside, Thomas stood and offered Lucas his hand. "Come on, I'll walk you out." Lucas smiled for the first time that day, crumbs on his chin, hope in his eyes. He took Thomas's hand without hesitation. And as they walked toward the front doors, neither of them noticed the car parked just down the street, engine idling, windows half lowered. Inside sat a man in a tailored suit, hands on the steering wheel, watching the scene unfold, a man who would remember this moment for the rest of his life. If this moment touched something in you, stay with us, because what happened next changed everything. And if you believe the world needs more stories like this, go ahead and like this video, and subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD. The next chapter might just restore your faith in people. The late afternoon light spilled across the school parking lot, casting long golden beams through the dust-speckled air. In a sleek black SUV parked a few spaces down from the front entrance, a man sat behind the wheel, engine idling softly. His name was Daniel Shaw, a name that echoed in medical boardrooms, news articles, and Forbes profiles. Billionaire. Innovator. Visionary. That's what they called him. But today, Daniel was just a father. And a deeply conflicted one. He hadn't meant to arrive early. Meetings had wrapped ahead of schedule, and instead of heading back to the office, he decided, on impulse, to come pick up his son from school himself. Something he hadn't done in years. Lucas's mother used to handle all of that. After the divorce, there had been promises, weekends, dinners, baseball games, but work had a way of pulling Daniel back in. There were always deals to close, projects to lead, lives to save. That was the irony. He saved thousands of lives through his healthcare empire, and somehow missed out on the one that mattered most. As he sat in the car, he'd been rehearsing what to say to Lucas. A simple "How was your day?" had begun to feel like a foreign phrase. But then he saw something unexpected, a man in a janitor's uniform walking slowly toward a small figure slumped on the bench. Daniel leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. It was Lucas. His son. Crying. His gut clenched. And then came the janitor, gentle, steady, calm, kneeling beside the boy like he was the most important person in the world. Daniel watched as the man listened. Really listened. No judgment. No hurry. Just presence. He couldn't hear every word, but he saw Lucas nodding slowly, wiping his tears. And then the janitor reached into his lunchbox and handed over what looked like a sandwich and a juice box, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Lucas accepted it with reverence. And they just sat there, side by side. No rush. No shame. That's when Daniel heard it. The janitor's voice, clear and steady through the slightly opened window. "You don't need new clothes to be a good person. You just need a clean heart." Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. A lump rose in his throat, unexpected and unfamiliar. He gripped the steering wheel and looked away for a second, blinking hard. He had spent his entire life building things, companies, hospitals, legacies. But this man, this quiet stranger with scuffed boots and calloused hands, had just built something far greater in 5 minutes. Trust. Comfort. Grace. And Daniel had never felt smaller. He watched as the man rose, offered Lucas a hand, and walked him to the school bus. Lucas glanced back once and waved, his face softer, lighter. Daniel didn't wave back. He couldn't. His hands were frozen, not by cold, but by shame. How had he not known his son felt that way? How had a stranger been more present in that moment than he had been in years? He stayed in the car long after the bus had pulled away, staring at the now empty bench. And then he made a decision, one that wasn't driven by business plans or quarterly projections, but by something far more urgent, the need to be better. To do better. He didn't know the janitor's name. Not yet. But he was going to find out. Because sometimes, the people who change your life aren't wearing lab coats or designer suits. Sometimes, they're wearing worn-out uniforms and carrying a mop, and still manage to clean more than just the floor. The next morning, the sun rose soft and golden over the quiet Texas school. Teachers trickled in, the smell of coffee drifting down the halls, papers rustling, classroom doors creaking open. It was a typical Thursday, to everyone else. But not for Daniel Shaw. He wasn't dressed like a billionaire today. No tailored suit. No entourage. Just a simple gray sweater over a collared shirt, khakis, and worn leather shoes that hadn't seen much daylight outside his closet. He walked the hall slowly, almost cautiously, like a man out of place, which he was. And yet, he wasn't looking for the principal or the superintendent. He was looking for the janitor. It took a few quiet inquiries and a teacher pointing down a side hallway before he found him. In the supply room, a cramped little space filled with brooms, buckets, and the faint scent of disinfectant. Thomas stood near the back, refilling spray bottles and checking a checklist clipped to the wall. He didn't hear Daniel at first. So Daniel cleared his throat gently. Thomas turned, a little surprised, but not startled. He offered the same calm nod he gave to anyone who crossed his path. "Can I help you?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag. Daniel stepped forward. "I think I'm the one who owes the help." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "I saw you yesterday," Daniel said quietly. "Sitting with my son." A pause. "I'm Daniel Shaw, Lucas's father." Thomas gave a soft nod. "He's a good kid. Just had a tough day." Daniel took a breath, then said, "You did something yesterday. Something I haven't been able to do in years. You reached him." There was no pride in his voice. No polished delivery. Just honesty, raw and slightly shaken. "You sat down next to my boy and made him feel like he mattered," Daniel continued. "You made him feel safe, like he could be exactly who he is. I watched you give him a sandwich and a kind word. And I realized, I don't even know what my son's favorite lunch is anymore." Thomas didn't say anything right away. He just looked at the man, really looked at him. And what he saw wasn't power or prestige. He saw a father trying to come home. "I'm not proud of that," Daniel added, voice low. "But I wanted to tell you, thank you. For doing what I didn't." Thomas gave a quiet chuckle and shook his head. "You don't owe me thanks." "But I do," Daniel insisted. Thomas looked down at the spray bottle in his hands, then back at Daniel. His eyes were steady, kind, but held the weight of a man who had seen a lot and never asked for anything. "I just did what I wish someone had done for me," he said. "When I was his age. I would have given anything for someone to sit beside me and say I was enough." Silence hung for a moment between them, not uncomfortable, but meaningful. Then Thomas added, "Kids don't need us to be perfect. They just need us to show up." Daniel swallowed hard. "I'm trying," he said, almost to himself. Thomas offered a gentle smile. "Then that's a good start." For a man used to million-dollar boardrooms and groundbreaking ideas, it was humbling to realize that the greatest wisdom he'd heard in years came from a janitor in a supply room. But in that moment, Daniel didn't feel small. He felt something rare, a quiet kind of hope. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he had to fix everything. He just had to be there. A week passed, quiet and uneventful, at least on the surface. Thomas went about his days the way he always had. He mopped the halls before sunrise, checked the faucets in the restrooms, replaced broken light bulbs, and smiled quietly at students as they rushed past him. He didn't talk about what had happened with Lucas. He didn't think anyone else knew. And he certainly didn't expect anything to come of it. That morning, a white envelope sat in his staff mailbox. Unusual, since he rarely received anything more than supply lists or maintenance reports. It was heavier than normal, sealed with a formal crest from the school district. He opened it slowly, cautiously, like someone who'd learned not to expect surprises. His eyes scanned the first few lines, then stopped. Dear Mr. Thomas, it is with deep gratitude and admiration that the school board shares this news. He read the letter once, then again, just to be sure he hadn't misread it. Inside, it said that an anonymous donor had established a scholarship fund in the name of Grace Harper, Thomas's late wife. The amount, $100,000. The purpose, to support underprivileged students in their pursuit of higher education. But that wasn't all. The letter went on to say that, effective immediately, Thomas was being appointed as the school's new life education advisor, a part-time mentorship role that would allow him to speak to students, lead small group discussions, and share his life experiences as part of a growing initiative in character education. He stood still in the hallway for a long moment, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. Grace's name. On a scholarship. It felt impossible, and yet there it was, printed in bold, official ink. Her name would live on not in a headstone or a photograph on a dusty mantle, but in the futures of children who needed a chance. Just like she had always wanted. Thomas blinked back the heat in his eyes and folded the letter carefully, holding it like something sacred. He walked slowly to the courtyard where he knew no one would bother him, sat down on the old wooden bench under the elm tree, and let the moment sink in. Grace had always believed in second chances, in planting seeds that others might one day harvest. And now, somehow, someone out there had done this, in her name. Of course, he had a feeling who the anonymous donor might be. He hadn't seen Daniel Shaw since that morning in the supply room, but the look in the man's eyes, the weight of what he carried, had said more than words ever could. But Thomas didn't need credit. He didn't need headlines. He didn't even need a thank you. This was enough. Later that week, the principal made the announcement to the staff and students. Mr. Thomas would now be leading weekly life talks, open sessions where students could come, ask questions, share stories, or just sit and listen. No lectures. No grades. Just a place to be heard. At first, only a handful of students showed up. Then more. And soon, every Wednesday afternoon, room 105, an old storage room converted with beanbags, second-hand chairs, and hand-painted signs, was filled with laughter, tears, and conversations that mattered. Thomas never raised his voice. He didn't try to be anyone's hero. He just told the truth, about struggle, about kindness, about what it means to keep going when life gets heavy. And the students listened. Because they knew he wasn't just reading from a script. He'd lived it. Thomas never stopped mopping the hallways. Even after the scholarship. Even after the new title. Even after students began waving to him in the halls and calling him Mr. T with a kind of warmth usually reserved for favorite uncles. He still showed up at dawn with his lunchbox in one hand and his keys jangling from his belt loop. He still checked the boilers, fixed the broken sink in the nurse's office, and wiped away muddy footprints after recess. But now, every Wednesday afternoon, he also stepped into room 105, not with a mop, but with a circle of chairs and a voice that had finally found its purpose. They called it Life Talks. No curriculum. No lectures. Just stories, questions, laughter, and sometimes quiet tears. Students came because they felt safe there. Because in that little room, surrounded by mismatched chairs and drawings taped to the wall, they weren't being tested or judged. They were being heard. Thomas shared pieces of his life, gently, never for sympathy, only to connect. He talked about growing up poor, about losing Grace, about raising a daughter who never gave up even when money was tight and grief hung heavy in the air. He listened too, really listened, to kids who were scared or angry, or just needed someone to notice them. And something beautiful began to happen. The shy kids started to speak. The angry ones began to soften. Even the teachers started dropping by, lingering in the doorway with quiet curiosity. Because somehow this janitor, this quiet man with gentle eyes, had turned a forgotten room into a place of healing. One student, more than any other, seemed to blossom under his care. Lucas. The little boy who once cried alone on a bench now walked the halls with confidence. His grades improved. He raised his hand in class. He joined the school choir. And every time someone asked what had changed, he'd smile and say the same thing. Mr. Thomas is the reason I didn't give up. One day, during a school assembly, Lucas stood in front of the whole student body, a microphone trembling slightly in his hand, and shared his story. How he almost quit school. How a man with a mop and a warm sandwich made him believe he mattered. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. But the story didn't end there. Unbeknownst to Thomas, Daniel Shaw, now a regular presence in Lucas's life, had quietly filmed one of the life talks. With Thomas's permission, he posted a short clip online, sharing how a janitor had done something no amount of money or therapy or parenting books ever could. He ended the post with a single line. Not everyone who changes your life wears a suit. Sometimes it's the one holding a mop, wiping away more than just the dirt. The video went viral. Thousands of comments poured in, from teachers, parents, former students, and strangers around the world. People who'd once felt invisible. People who remembered their own Mr. Thomas from years ago. People who had lost hope and found it again in this quiet man's story. Reporters called. Interviews were offered. Awards were suggested. But Thomas didn't want the spotlight. He just wanted room 105 to be ready by Wednesday. And so he stayed. He still fixed the heaters when they groaned in winter. Still swept up glitter after art class. Still whistled softly to himself while wiping down lunch tables. But now, he also gave kids a reason to believe they were worth something, no matter what they wore, where they came from, or what they were carrying inside. And somehow, in doing that, he gave himself the same gift. Because in a world that often looks up to find heroes, sometimes the ones who matter most are right there beneath us, wiping the floor and lifting hearts. In a world that moves too fast, where titles and wealth often drown out quiet goodness, Thomas reminds us of something timeless. The most lasting impact comes from simple human kindness. You don't need fancy words or expensive suits to change a life. Sometimes, all it takes is a listening ear, a warm meal, and a heart that remembers what it's like to be overlooked. His story teaches us that dignity is not in what we have, but in how we care for others, especially when no one is watching. For those of us who have lived long enough to know life's true value, this is a gentle reminder. It's never too late to show up for someone, and it's never too small to matter. If stories like this speak to your heart, help us share more of them. Like this video, and subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD, where everyday heroes remind us what justice, love, and humanity truly look like.